relationship, and we just wanted more of an in-depth understanding of our own religion. As children, we didn't understand what was going on. They were speaking in Greek. So we just thought that taking this catechism class together would enlighten us more and would really explain some of the questions that we had. And I've been reading my Greek Bible for a long, long time now. And a lot of what we've discussed has aligned with what's in my Bible, of course. And so it's just nice to meet other people who are practicing our religion and trying to understand more about it.
I think you definitely express a common problem that we haven't had really excellent education growing up in our faith. It's getting much better, but it's still always a challenge. And it's wonderful as adults to be able to come and deepen our faith in many ways. So, Anastasia?
Oh, hi. And again, I never put my face out here, so I share the same feelings. I am Greek Orthodox, and I live up in Northbrook, so I was looking for a church, and you guys were close, and I've been to St. Peter Paul for the last few years, but it's curiosity, clarity. I say the same thing that Connie said. I went to church a lot as a kid, and I could say part of the divine liturgy, but I don't even know what I'm saying as I was growing up. So it's been very, very, very interesting. I think all of you have done an excellent job. Excellent.
Thank you.
There's a lot. There is a lot.
There's a lot.
But every week I go into the other room and I tell my husband, guess what? Guess what this means? Guess what? So thank you. Thank you very much. And it's the curiosity of our knowing what does this mean, being an Orthodox. So thank you.
And honestly, it's a journey that you keep sort of retreading the same path each time, noticing more things. And even though I've spent many a year learning and studying, I cannot tell you how many things now I read again. I'm like, whoa, that's wonderful. I didn't see it, or I see it with such greater clarity. Certainly, even reading scripture, I just want to say, is I think that one of the things that we need to do is read scripture more. But let me tell you, you can never open it without uncovering some new treasure. So I think that's the same with our Orthodox faith. Tatiana? I think we haven't heard from you.
I'm unmuted myself.
Yeah.
So I came from Protestant background, and I'm learning about Orthodox Church and religion and everything, with intention to join and get baptized, hopefully.
All right, sounds good. And for those of you who don't know me, I've actually been at St. Peter and Paul since before St. Peter and Paul started. Really, quite literally, because my parents were among the people that first met and tried to organize the church and asked for a charter and bought the land. And I was a mere little baby, but no, really, I was about, I guess, 5. I remember the church before the property was bought. Don't remember, but I have a memory of the very earliest days of our church. So I've been, but like so many of you express, I grew up in the faith, but I didn't really know my faith. And I pursued religious studies in sort of a general, I just had a curiosity about religion. But it wasn't until a Protestant professor of mine said, well, you know, Helen, you can't really do theology in a vacuum. You have to stand somewhere. Where do you stand? And he said, why don't you go to your own seminary and find out? And within a few weeks, I absolutely fell in love with Orthodoxy. And I felt, this is amazing. And so I've never looked back. So tonight, though, what we are going to do, instead of really unlocking the mysteries and beauty and of the teachings of our faith, we're actually going to take a slightly different road, and that is to see where is Orthodoxy today in America? we have a unique situation, not entirely unique because it is sort of paralleled in Australia and a few other places, but really in the United States, the way Orthodoxy came to the United States, the way it has evolved, has grown, and where it's going today has its own characteristics. And so there's a bit of a historical element to today's class. However, it also looks more deeply into how we behave as Orthodox, how we relate to one another, and what is our vision for Orthodoxy here in America. So there is definitely some major historical background, but it really is important in order to understand why we are the way we are today in America. So that's the focus of this session. I noticed that you all were asked to read materials that were preliminary or took the centuries prior to the current situation. I won't go into detail on those. I'll only just sort of tangentially touch on them insofar as they impact the reality that we experience. But you will see that the historical journeys of Orthodoxy in the different countries were like in Russia was very, very different from that under Ottoman rule. And I do encourage you to read those histories. I think it's very helpful. So now I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint and get you started. Let's see here. Takes me a bit of a minute or two to get everything squared away. Okay, and share the screen. Okay, put that up. Get this like that. There we go. All right, and then minimize this. So one of the things I love about this particular icon to start our discussion of Orthodoxy in America is that it shows that we have a garden of saints, if you will, already amongst us here. And in order for an Orthodox church to be really recognized as fully sort of launched in a country, one of the things that's needed is to have saints that are specifically recognized as connected with that land, that place. And in fact, we do. Some of these saints I will talk about a little bit more in detail in terms of their lives, but it's just to give you a sense of where we're going. No women yet, but we are hoping that will change fairly soon. So, all right. I mentioned the historical backgrounds, and one of the most important aspects of the history of Orthodoxy that impacts the church here in the United States is the development of ethno-national religious identities among the Orthodox in the 19th century. Why do I combine all those things together? Because we normally describe it as an ethnic identity, Greek, Russian, Serbian, but clearly those ethnicities are also associated with the particular nations. Those nations, for the most part, emerged in the late 19th century. What was prior? Well, what had happened for almost all of the Orthodox churches in the world, apart from Russia, was they had succumbed to invasion by the Arab and Turkish Muslim armies. And Byzantium fell to the Ottoman Turks. And indeed, that sort of encompassed a great variety of Orthodox communities. The Ottoman Empire used something called the millet system in order to sort of facilitate its rule over this really vast and diverse territory, different peoples, different types of places. What was the millet system? It was really a legal structure of organization and rule that enabled a confessional, or sort of identified a confessional community known as the dhimmi, which was a word used to describe a protected people, that is, a people of the book. When I say protected, I mean it recognized that this group, this confessional community, had the right to maintain its own religious worship and identity, but with a great many restrictions. What do I mean by had the right to retain it? If you were not part of a dhimmi or a protected people, you had to convert to Islam. There was no option in it. It was conversion or death. So being known as one of the dhimmi, the Orthodox community was enabled to survive as a separate but subordinate entity within a larger whole. Each of these millet communities, and there was an Armenian one, a Jewish one, and an Orthodox one, and there was a very, very small one for the Roman Catholic under Ottoman rule. And eventually there was one for Buddhism, but we're not going to get into all that. The millet was under the supervision of an ethnarch. That was clearly the connection of ethnos, a people associated with an ethnic identity and a sort of personage, if you will, a series of behaviors and religions and a religion, etc. Ethnarch and archon is the Greek word for rule. So the one who is the ruler of that ethnic community, the national leader. And this was almost uniformly the religious leader of that community, the primate. For the Orthodox, it was the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople. And this person reported directly to the Ottoman Sultan and received investiture from him. His authority came directly from the Ottoman Sultan. Initially, all the Eastern Orthodox were clustered into what was known as the Rum millet, taken from the word for Roman, like Roman Empire. The Byzantines, they didn't call them Byzantines, they called them Romans. Side note, my grandmother was born and raised in Constantinople as a Greek Orthodox Christian in Constantinople. And they call themselves that. They call themselves Romianos, the Romans. Okay. Anyway, yes, these ethno-national identities remained active, but in fact, in sort of a clandestine or underground way. Why? Because under the Ottoman Turks, all the Orthodox who were Eastern Orthodox, not the Oriental Orthodox, those were the Armenians, the Coptics, etc. But the Eastern Orthodox, the Serbians, the Albanians, the Greeks, whoever was in their territory that belonged to that Eastern Orthodox community were grouped together. And so for a while, there was an attempt to sort of mash all the different Orthodox communities together, but they did remain in many ways as ethnic communities, even within the larger whole. Why do I say all this? Because that was how the church and the people managed to hold on to their identity from 1453 until the mid-19th century. It's about 500 years, okay, 500 years. This is amazing strength to be able to retain your faith and your identity as a community, as a people, as a church through centuries of both overt and subtle oppressions and just forces that we're trying to absorb them into the ruling nation. So these ethno-religious identities were formed as a means of survival through centuries of submission. The children learned the language. They were able, through Ottoman rule, to retain worship, but nothing else. Worship and their language. They weren't allowed to have schools, except, of course, they did, but at night and hidden. And, there are songs about the children going to school by the light of the moon to learn about their faith. But what happened, though, in the 19th century is that the grasp of Ottoman rule began to slacken, and the national groups won political independence and gained sovereignty. And this move coincided with the establishment now of Orthodox communities in the New World territory. So what you saw globally is, for example, Greece emerging from Ottoman rule and establishing itself as a Church of Greece. Bulgaria emerging, establishing its own patriarchate. Serbia. And I want you to notice the dates: 1833 for Greece, 1872 for Bulgaria, 1879 for Serbia, 1865 for Romania. Notice that there's, in parentheses, it says recognized. And I do see I have to fix my PowerPoint a little bit, but nevertheless, recognized means that they declared themselves autocephalous. They weren't recognized by the ecumenical patriarch and the other autocephalous Orthodox churches until the dates when they were recognized. So, for example, Bulgaria declared itself in 1872. It wasn't until 1945 that they were recognized, but they operated as an independent, self-governing church. It's just that for various reasons, they weren't recognized. Keep that in mind, because this is something that is an ongoing problem today and will impact the church in America. Serbia, 1879, Romania, Georgia. Some of them came through much later because of where they were with regard to the Ottoman Empire, the kinds of sort of political events that led to their emergence and sovereignty. We'll talk about this one later: Orthodox Church in America, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and Orthodox Church of Macedonia. But notice Orthodox Church in America, 1970, still not fully recognized. Orthodox Church of Ukraine, still not recognized, in the Macedonian. All right, now we are going to America. These things are important in background because it shaped the way the Orthodox communities thought about each other here, thought about themselves, thought about each other, and related to their mother churches in these newly emerged homelands that they had this strong connection to because of hundreds of years of sort of expressing themselves and clinging to their identity through this close connection between ethnicity and orthodoxy. But orthodoxy came to America in two very different paths, really unlike what you will see for example, in Australia or some other places. In America, the first path is through mission. Following the initial presence of Russian explorers and traders in the late 18th century, missionaries came from Russia with the purpose of evangelizing the New World. This was all happening in the far Northwest Territories, Alaska and those territories. The second major pathway was through immigrants, bringing their Orthodox faith basically on their backs with them from the old world and from their countries that they are coming from, right? These two different paths initially are independent, but by the mid-19th century, you begin to see them intersect. And there was a real attempt to intertwine them into one sort of reality, and I will talk about this, but historical events once again explode really and intervene, and historical events happening not in the US, but in the homeworld, old homeward world countries, intervene and prevent the traditional canonical process that the church had for establishing the faith in a new land. Instead, a unique process occurs. And just to give you a little background, how did the church go from, one place to the other in the old time? I mean, and prior to the US? Well, it was through missionary activity. What you would have is for example, in the Byzantine Empire, Cyril and Methodius went out to the Slavic peoples. They translated the gospel and the services into the language of the native people. They preached the gospel. They began to convert people. As that occurred and grew, and you have more faithful coming, you ordain people who are studying from the native population. You establish schools. You grow the church there. You recognize saints. You ordain a bishop to be the bishop of that new territory, and the church moves so that now there's the Orthodox Church in Serbia or the Orthodox Church in Russia. It wasn't really the Russian Orthodox Church. It was just simply the church, but now in this new land. And this is how it started in America. The Orthodox Church was coming to America through mission. But then you had that second path. All right. I have a nice little map here. Okay. So what you have here are the Russian missionaries coming mostly through the far Northwest to the Alaska territories. Sorry, guys. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry, hang on, just be patient. Okay, I'm trying to move my, all right, I'm gonna ignore that. On my screen, I have bars that interfere with what I see. Hopefully you don't, but because of that, I was trying to move it. And as I did that, I end up moving the PowerPoint, which is why you saw that. All right, so Russian missionaries first bring the Orthodox faith to native peoples in the far Northwest. In 1794 was the first missionary activity. We'll see that in the next slide. And it spread down to San Francisco, the western coast. On the other hand, mostly in the late 19th century, and really just exploding between 1880 and 1920, you have immigrants coming, mostly landing in New York, but also quite a number in Florida and in New Orleans, which is where you see some other early communities. So let's look a little bit at that missionary activity. In 1794, the mission started through monks, including St. Herman of Alaska. Monks from Valam Monastery traveled 7,327 miles, taking 293 days. Just think of that. To arrive at Kodiak Island, bringing Orthodoxy to the Alaskan territories. Before them, Russian traders and trappers and explorers had landed on those territories and actually had started even to intermarry with Native people. And they really wanted their faith. They wanted a priest to come and so they could worship. They wanted to baptize their wives and children. So this was very much sought after, and the monks were determined to evangelize this new people. You saw in this group of 8 monks, one who was martyred when a tribal group, he actually, Juvenali had preached to many and had converted many, but a shaman in one of the tribal groups saw him as a threat and he was killed. We have the consecration of the first bishop for Alaska in 1799, Yosef. He had returned to Russia in order to receive that elevation so that he could return to America with that greater authority. And he had also come with complaints that the Russian merchants were excessively cruel, and he wanted authority to be able to supersede their decisions. Unfortunately, he and his companions died in a shipwreck on his way back. St. Herman, a very beloved monk, had remained back in the Alaskan territories. For a while, he was actually alone. He ended up spending time as a solitary monk, but very beloved. Really, almost immediately upon his death, he was acclaimed as a saint by the people of the area and eventually was recognized. He died in 1837. We see the growth of this mission, real amazing growth. In 1824, a priest comes with his wife and children to Unalaska, Alaska. He learns the Aleut language, he translates materials, he ceaselessly travels. The stories are amazing. He would take his kayak and go for, hundreds of miles, finding people, preaching to them, baptizing them. He was a man of great strength and incredible endurance. Eventually, he does return to Russia. In the return trip, his wife passes. And he actually then is later in 1840 consecrated as bishop with the name of Innocent. We have in 1825 already, they have Native people who are studying the faith. And in 1825, the first Native priest is ordained. A seminary is formed in Sitka, an Orthodox mission school, 1843, 1844. The cathedral is established in Sitka in 1848. The first Russian parish established in U.S. territory in San Francisco was built in 1868. And that very same Father John, who became Bishop Innocent, returned to Russia in 1868 and was consecrated as Metropolitan of Moscow. It's equivalent to the Patriarch of Moscow, because at that time, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Patriarchate had been abolished. Don't want to even start with that history, but it's not restored until 1917 on the eve of the Russian Revolution. I should mention that the first Patriarch of the newly restored Russian Orthodox Church, the new Patriarchate of the Russian Orthodox Church in 1917, was a man who served as bishop of the American diocese prior to his time in Russia, and Tikhon, but we'll get to him in a minute. We see in 1870 the establishment of a diocese. It's no longer a mission territory. It's an actual diocese of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. Okay. This is the canonical path to establishing a new church in a new land. And it's all fell right in line with the way it should be done according to the canons of the church. And I'm going to give you a few little nice pictures. St. Innocent of Alaska and Moscow. That's the same one I told you, who is Father John, who ultimately was raised to be Bishop Innocent and then Archbishop of Moscow, Metropolitan of Moscow. Here we have a picture of the native congregation in Seal, Alaska in 1905. Here you see, again, a Russian priest with chiefs and headmen of the Tlingits in Sitka, Alaska. I had told you about the cathedral, St. Michael's. Here's its earliest picture that we have, photo that we have, 1844, and between 1844 and 1848 was built. Here we see it consecrated as a cathedral in 1887. This is what it looks like today with a copper roof. By the time the Alaskan territories were sold to America in 1867, this Russian mission had grown to 12,000 native Christians, just the native Christians that had been baptized. 9 parishes, 35 chapels, 17 schools, and 4 orphanages. We are on our way. But that's so a few more pictures of Russian Orthodox Church in the mission area around 1900, Orthodox wedding on St. Paul Island in the Alaskan territories. All right, but that wasn't the only thing happening. Okay, that was all happening, but it was happening on the West Coast. What else was happening? The second path for Orthodoxy in America was occurring, right? And that's the Orthodox faith coming to the New World through immigration. Between 1870 and 1910, there were more than 25 million, something like 27, 28 million immigrants arrived in the United States. Now, of course, the vast majority were not Orthodox, but we'll see soon what some of those numbers meant for Orthodox. So here are the Ellis Island immigrants. And what I have here is the earliest photo of the Eastern Orthodox Church of Holy Trinity in New Orleans. This was actually, this comes from 1911, but the actual parish was established much earlier. Let's talk a little bit about what these immigrants were doing, okay? What did they find here? Now, remember, on the West Coast, you are seeing clergy, you have monks, you have clergy, you have schools, you have a cathedral built. What did these immigrants find? Nothing, nothing. They came, there were no priests, there was no administrative structure, there were no bishops, there were no dioceses, there were no church. And these lay immigrant people started to do it all themselves because their faith was so strong. They wanted to worship in their faith. They wanted to have their children raised in the faith. And they began to raise funds and purchase property. They wrote home. Where were they going to find clergy? They didn't know about anything that was happening on the West Coast. So what do? They contact the people they knew from the homeland that they came from. And so, of course, each ethnic community was writing back to their own ethnic hierarchs and begging for clergy to celebrate the sacraments. In the meantime, they had to set things up. They had to have some sort of a parish board to govern, to make decisions, know what to buy, know what to build, etc. So they began to establish parish boards and councils. They had to educate their children. There were no schools, so they began to recruit their own people and the best and the most educated among them to begin to establish educational schools for their children, Sunday schools. Very high on the list because of the way in which it enabled them to retain their identity through the centuries was religious and language schools, okay, combined together. So the language, the culture, and the faith were all taught together in their schools. You can see how that got separated out. The longer the community stayed in America, but early on, it was all wrapped together. And actually for decades. You began to see women's groups and charity groups established, youth groups established, all again, primarily by lay activity. Programs for the assistance of the new immigrants, the poor, the hungry, the homeless, almost always, though, within their own ethnic group. And of course, they wanted to bury their faithful in a place that felt like their home. And so they purchased lands for cemeteries. I say all this because the people here did not come with the attitude and the idea that they were somehow going to usurp the power of the clergy or circumvent the activity of church administration through the hierarchy, right? That wasn't it at all. They really needed to build it themselves, and they began to build it. It fit also with the ethos, the mentality of the American spirit, where really you see a need, you find a solution, you work to build it. It's sort of in your own hands, that sense of independence and self-reliance. But in the meantime, what was going on the West Coast didn't stop. It's not like they said, oh, yeah, the immigrants are coming. They're writing and getting people to come over here to serve them. Well, we don't need to do anything anymore. Of course not. The Russian mission really began to understand that it needs to reach out from the initial movement of evangelization of Native people to become a church that could meet the needs across the country of the different groups. And so you actually see the move of the diocese from Alaska to San Francisco in 1872. And then again from there to New York in 1905. The work shifts to include outreach to the non-Orthodox, especially the natives, and ministry to the Orthodox immigrants across America. What you hear at this time in the writings and the work of the hierarchs from this Russian diocese is a vision of parishes that are multi-ethnic, but if needed, could also be more or less, predominantly one ethnic group with a priest that meets the needs of that ethnic group. Nevertheless, all under the oversight of that one primate from this diocese. So the idea was really that this one primate would keep everything sort of unified, but then you could have diversity according to the needs of the parishes. And in fact, you see a real interest in training, supporting, and elevating people from different ethnic backgrounds to minister to these particular ethnic communities. And I'll specify that in a minute. Some other aspects that show that this Russian diocese is really moving into the life of Orthodox people in America, not just a mission work. In 1906, they actually said, well, we should stop commemorating the Tsar. we should commemorate the American president, because they noticed that the people who were born in America were very uncomfortable commemorating the Tsar and not the American president. So, he's like, well, we're in America. This is the person we need to commemorate. It's something really quite unusual. In 1907, this Russian diocese called its first All-American Sobor. Sobor is the word they use for council, and changed the name from the mission of the the Diocese of the Aleutians in North America. It changed the name to the Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church in America. Remember, Catholic in the sense of Catholicos, or the whole church, the one whole church. Same way we use it in the creed, of course. It's not Roman Catholic, obviously. And for the first time since the Seventh Ecumenical Council, 787, in case you guys don't remember, laymen are allowed to sit and participate in the council. Now, they didn't make any trouble. There was no argument that they more or less just agreed to what was being done. But this began the participation of lay people in the work of the church on an official and administrative way in America. I told you about how the Russian diocese lifted up people who sort of could meet the needs of specific ethnic communities. And I'm going to highlight 3 who were recognized as saints. There were more, but one of the first is Father Alexis Toth. He actually was Carpatho-Russian, and he was part of the Eastern Rite Catholic community. He got into a big argument with the cardinal in Minneapolis, and because of his actions, he brought thousands eventually of Eastern Rite Catholics back into the fold of the Orthodox Church. Following his conversion to Orthodoxy, he tirelessly preached his new faith, the Orthodox faith, to other Eastern Rite Catholics in North America. By the time he died in 1909, he had facilitated the conversion of over 20,000 Eastern Rite Catholics to Russian Orthodoxy. He worked to, and through him, this particular element, they're not really exactly like the Russian Orthodox, so they had their own sort of persons to minister to them. Even more different was the community that came from Syria. And indeed, one of the greatest saints of the Orthodox Church in America is Archimandrite Raphael Hawaweni, who was consecrated in 1904 as the Bishop of Brooklyn. He is, in fact, the first bishop physically consecrated in America. Prior to that, all the bishops were consecrated outside America, in Russia, and then brought here. He was consecrated in Brooklyn, first person, specifically to serve the Syrian community. He's a very interesting man because he really was multilingual. He spoke Greek, he spoke Russian, he spoke Arabic. He considered himself an Orthodox of all those communities. He is, to him, really, there are something like 29 Antiochian Orthodox parishes were founded during his time, the present-day Cathedral of the Antiochian Orthodox Archdiocese. And he was one of the founders of St. Tikhon's Orthodox Monastery. But he did all this under the Russian diocese. There was no Antiochian Orthodox diocese at this point. So you can see the Russian diocese was growing and expanding. And one more person, Father Sebastian Davovich, a Serbian Orthodox, who is also now recognized as Saint Sebastian of San Francisco and Jackson, California. raised to the rank of archimandrite by the Russian primate here to serve the Serbian community in California. And I have here, this is a picture of that church currently today. It's a beautiful picture. So you see these things are happening, but one of the key figures in doing all of this was Archbishop Tikhon. In 1905, when the see was transferred to New York, he was presiding. He was indeed a great visionary. He saw the church here as really meeting the needs of all the people as one unified and eventually self-ruling autocephalous church in America. He actually left America. He was called back to Russia. And as I told you, on the eve of the Russian Revolution, the patriarchate was restored in Russia. He became the first patriarch of Moscow and all Russia at that time. But he perished under Soviet rule as a martyr for the faith. And so he is a saint, enlightener, and martyr, really a confessor of the faith. We've had some great people associated with work here in the United States, truly amazing people. And this comes from his own writing. He says, the diocese is not only multinational, it is composed of several Orthodox churches which keep the unity of the faith, but preserve their peculiarities in canonical structure, in liturgical rules, in parish life. So he's got this vision, not just that they're multinational, different ethnic groups that are coming together, but they have sort of their own way of being Orthodox. These peculiarities are dear to them and can perfectly well be tolerated in the pan-Orthodox scene. We do not consider that we have the right to suppress the national character of the churches here. On the contrary, we try to preserve this character, and we confer on them the latitude to be governed by leaders of their own nationality. You can see how he lived. He didn't just say that; he walked the walk. He ordained people and elevated to them to address the needs of these communities, while still being one administrative unity, one diocese, right? He goes on to say life in the new world is different from that in the old. A greater autonomy and possibly autocephaly should be granted to the church in America. So he said that all the way back in 1905. But things were beginning the tensions were rising, and there was the beginning of the fracturing into jurisdictional divisions. All right. I'm going to take us up to the Russian Revolution with this particular slide here. So what happens in the beginning of the 20th century, the second decade of the 20th century, and maybe a little bit before, you see a huge influx of Greeks. So between 1890 and 1910, about 300,000 Greeks arrive, and between 1910 and 1920, another 300,000 join them. Okay, this number completely swamps anything that the Russian diocese had in their own parishes, or the ability of that diocese to meet the needs of these communities, right? In the meantime, these groups speak Greek, these people speak Greek, and they are writing back to the Church of Constantinople. Most of them came from places that had been under Byzantine rule and belonged to the Church of Constantinople. However, because of political instability, the church there was still under Ottoman rule. The church in Greece was free, was self-governing. For time being, the church in Constantinople specifically authorized the Church of Greece to have authority over these communities in America. Of course, you could say, well, what about that Russian diocese? But there really wasn't communication. There wasn't a sense of recognition and communication. And as I said before, it was very spread out and didn't have any ability to meet the needs of these people. So the Church of Greece began to establish churches and build a presence in America. They weren't the only ones, but the first ones we should mention were Holy Trinity in New Orleans in 1864. That actually started out as a pan-Orthodox parish. But the ones that were established in New York in 1892 and in Chicago in the 1890s were really clearly predominantly Greek. Besides what was happening, though, among the Greeks, you saw similar dynamics in the other ethnic Orthodox communities. The first Albanian parish was established in Boston in 1908. In 1913, despite the work of Father Sebastian Dabovich, who became Saint Sebastian, nevertheless, 12 Serbian parishes petitioned for permission to go under the authority of the Serbian Patriarch to leave the Russian fold. And you see the same thing happen in 1915 of certain Arab parishes, okay, wanting to go under the Patriarch of Antioch. Possibly, some of this could have been worked out with the Russian diocese. Possibly, these communities may have been able to dialogue with the Russian primate who was here and work out a system where they could retain unity under his oversight with independence sort of for those different communities, more or less independence. But that was not going to happen because of what happened overseas in the old world countries. Really catastrophic events occurred. I'm going to take our break now. It seems like a perfect time. And let's take 5 minutes. And I'm going to stop the share for a minute and just say that I know, oh, look, my video isn't working. I told you it might not work. Let's see if it will start up again. Yay. All right. So I'm gonna actually take my video off and we'll break for 5 minutes and I'll come back in about, let's say 8:06, hopefully. So get up and stretch and we'll be back soon. All right. All right. Let's see, 8:05. Okay. My timestamp still says 8:05. I'll wait another second or two, a few seconds. Yeah, grab my water. All right. Welcome back, everybody. So I'm going to pause for a second before I share again. Do we have questions about what we've heard so far? The journey of orthodoxy so far. Matt, did you have a question? No?
Yeah, I had a quick question.
Sure.
I was wondering, because I think you said like the Moscow Patriarchate granted like autocephaly to the Orthodox Church in America.
Mhm.
And I was wondering, is it normal for churches like after granting like autocephaly to maintain church? Because I know there's ROCOR, right, which is like Russian Church Abroad, and that's under the Moscow Patriarchate, right? So like, why is there still I don't know, like I guess, is there a reason that Russia recognizes this church as autocephalous but then still maintains churches?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Matt, because it is non-canonical. That, in other words, it actually violates the canons of the church, which actually were written not envisioning a reality where you would have multiple Orthodox communities all claiming canonical authority in those particular. So the entire jurisdictional reality is non-canonical. In other words, it does not conform to the way the church has understood itself and written its rules about how to be in different places. There should be, in fact, one single Orthodox body, one body of the church in one territory, one region. And if you more canonically appropriate would be, if you wanted to think of it this way, you could divide America into multiple regions and each have an authority that is autocephalous or independent. But to have them all in the same territory is inappropriate. It's non-canonical, and it is ultimately counterproductive and unhealthy. Why did the Church of Russia do that? Well, I can't say that all the other patriarchs thought it was a good idea because they don't. They don't. This is one reason why the ecumenical patriarch will not recognize the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in America. Why it's, when it said still pending or whatever, or under discussion or whatever I put in the slide, because, well, for two reasons. Number one, there's a question of who grants autocephaly to a community or a daughter church. Who's the actual mother of that whole sequence of, to say they have the authority to grant autocephaly. But the second thing is to recognize that there were still multiple churches not being gathered under the fold of that one church. And therefore, how could you grant them autocephaly while you still have these other competing communities? So the long answer is sort of what I gave you, the rambling one, but the short answer is that it is actually not a status that is recognized by all the other Orthodox patriarchs. Some do, some don't. And it is not in keeping with the canons of the church. How to resolve this is a huge question. So part of the reason Moscow did that is because the autocephaly of OCA was granted long before ROCOR had reconciled with Moscow. Actually, in 1970, when that autocephaly was granted to the OCA, ROCOR had no relationship except one of animosity with they were at odds with each other and that was overcome in the 90s, which led to their coming under the oversight of the Moscow Patriarch, but nothing changed for the OCA at that point. Interestingly enough, OCA and ROCOR had been out of communion, but now they were both in communion with Moscow. So that meant that they could be in communion with each other. So that established their sort of like sacramental unity without actually giving them administrative unity, if you will. So yes, we are still in anomalous times. So
Okay, but so it kind of had to do with I think ROCOR, from what my understanding, I don't have a huge background in this, but ROCOR and the Moscow Patriarchate, like kind of under communism, in Russia had falling out, right?
absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so it kind of had to do with that, and to some degree. Okay.
Yep, it had to do with
Gotcha.
Moscow finally being free of Soviet domination, and then ROCOR was able to, reconcile with them. There were, of course, certain things that had to be overcome, anathemas and things, excommunications and things, but they were able to work it out. So.
Okay, gotcha. That makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. All right, so we are going to go. If any other questions? All right. I do want to encourage you all. Yeah, I keep going on and on, but if you have a question, I am totally fine with you unmuting and interrupting me and say, Helen, I have a question. All right. So if hopefully at the end we'll have an opportunity, but you can stop me in the midst. So back to sharing screen now. Let's see here. All right. And boom. All right. So political turmoil. And let me tell you, all of the most extreme political turmoil was seen in Russia. There was chaos in Greece. There was stuff happening in Serbia. It was all over the place for all of the old world Orthodox churches. Clearly, between 1917 and 1923, and subsequent to then, but those were the years of the greatest upheaval, not knowing what was going to happen, and the beginning of the militant atheism that I love the way that College Swear calls it militant atheism, that really was aiming in the beginning to destroy the church. Under the Bolshevik Revolution, throws the Church of Russia into chaos, and indeed the Russian mission in America, you could say the Russian diocese in America, was stranded. It depended on Mother Russia for resources, for money, for priests. They had some that they were ordaining here and educating, but they still needed more. Believe me, in the early 20th century, iconostasis, vestments, etc., all kinds of resources came from Russia, completely blocked now. Absolutely nothing was coming from Russia. In the meantime, what you have with the Greek communities is somebody who was actually the Archbishop of Athens, the primate of the Greek Orthodox Church in Greece, arrives in the US to organize the Greek parishes here. Now, I'm not going to tell you about the political upheaval back in Greece, but Metaxakis was part of it. Interestingly enough, because of his various actions, this is the point in time that Constantinople rescinds transferring the Greek parishes. In the US, they had transferred to Greece, they took it back. Okay, they took the parishes, the Greek parishes back, Constantinople did, and that was accepted by Greece, not in 1918 when it happened, but in 1922. Interestingly enough, I should say, as an additional point, Metaxakis ends up becoming the ecumenical patriarch. So just saying, lots of stuff happening. Similarly, you have stuff happening with the Serbians. In 1926, the Serbian Orthodox Diocese of America was established because, again, there was nothing from Russia. The Ukrainians in 1928, the Romanians in 1929. So all of that was now being established as official dioceses here in the US, competing, not working together, each operating independently. And what was happening to the Russian people here? Well, they split ultimately into three groups here. Across the world, there were four, but here in America, there were three. Two most prominent ones are in 1921, what happened in the world was that the bishops of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, so all the bishops who were of different territories now outside of Russia, they were not going to put themselves under the direction of a primate who was clearly being oppressed by the Soviets. Okay, so they met in Karlovy, Serbia, and they broke from Moscow. They understood that as a temporary break, but nevertheless, it was real independence at that point. They became known initially as the Synod Church, but then ultimately ROCOR, as the group that Matt was mentioning. And yes, it was precipitated by communism, by the Soviet control and influence over the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. The other thing that happened, though, and so ROCOR started in overseas in Europe, but actually had presence here in America. But the other thing that was occurring here is that the Russian mission diocese, the Russian Orthodox Church here in the US, with the name the Metropolia, okay, itself voted in 1924 to set up temporary self-government and broke ties with Moscow. So now you have two active Russian communities here in the US, one ROCOR from more or less primates that were outside of the US, and the one here in the US called the Metropolia. And they were actually operating independently. They gained their independence through different events. And indeed, they were not in communion. They attempted, we're not going to get all the details of how they tried to work together, and then they broke up and were back and forth. Okay, so by 1930, you have the Ukrainians, the Romanians, the Serbians, two different Russian communities, and the Greeks at least, and you have the Antiochians starting, and so, however, okay, I'm going to just point to this very last one first, okay? The Orthodox communities, they're all still closely tied to their mother churches and are being impacted by the political events in the old world countries. Think of what was happening in the 20s and especially the 30s as you're moving toward World War II. All kinds, and communism taking hold of those countries or trying to. You have wars, skirmishes, arguments, and that is being reproduced among the communities here. So you began to see divisions, separate, basically separate church communities established within the Greek, the Serbian, the Antiochian, the Bulgarian, the Russian, and okay, I didn't mean to write Bulgarian twice. I have to do a little editing here, but okay. I think I meant to write Ukrainian there, churches. And what I mean by divisions, I mean there were two Greek, two Serbian, two Antiochian, or more All right. The Ukrainian churches were probably like 4. However, despite all of that turmoil, positive things were happening in 1930s. A visionary leader became the Archbishop of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in 1931. Ultimately, he was elevated to be Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras, well known as the one who met with the Pope for the first time in how many centuries. In 1933, a third Russian group was established in North America, the Russian Exarchate. So now you have the Metropolia, the Rokor, and you have this Russian Exarchate. It's actually quite small, though. In 1936, a visionary for the Antiochians, Metropolitan Anthony Bashir, was consecrated, but they broke up into 2 groups. Other positive things, though, in 1937, Holy Cross was founded. That's the Greek Orthodox Theological School. St. Vladimir's, the Russian Orthodox Theological Seminary, was established in 1938. St. Tikhon's, 1938 as well. You have the Bulgarian Orthodox Mission Diocese established in 1938 as well. And then, as I mentioned, you have these continuing rifts. All right, but I'm going to show you some photos of the positive stuff. Here you have, at the upper left, you have a very early photo of St. Tikhon's, and then one that's more current. You have the photo of the chapel of St. Vladimir Seminary and the Church of Hellenic Cross, Holy Cross School of Theology. This is in Boston, this is in New York, and St. Tikhon's is in Pennsylvania. All right. During this time frame, and really up through to the beginning of the 20th, 21st century, the word that was used most frequently for describing the Orthodox communities in America was diaspora. This is the language that the mother churches used to describe the communities here. And it was something that was their own mindset. So I really think we need to explore this idea of diaspora and how it relates to the jurisdictional system. Diaspora really means those who are dispersed. This is not really your home. Your home is somewhere else. Your origin, your place of origin is really where you take your identity and you are flung like a seed to a new territory. You are dispersed, but you must retain who you are, even as you are planted in this new land, to grow up as a form of the mother church now in this new territory. In many ways, it harks back to the Jewish diaspora as they were thrown out of Israel and moved across the world, the idea of retaining their identity and their faith, ethnic and religious identity, through the worship, but also through their cultural sort of activities and expression. This is what you see. This is what you saw, certainly, and what you do continue to see to a great degree among the Orthodox. And it's reinforced by this jurisdictional system, which, as I think I've tried to point out, it wasn't intentionally established this way. It was sort of something that occurred through the vagaries of history, as well as how the communities themselves had managed to survive over the centuries of oppression. So I'm now quoting from a document that was written at the beginning of the 21st century. Alexei Krinjich had been commissioned by the Assembly of Bishops to do a survey of Orthodox communities, and this is part of his finding. He says, because of this forced pattern of immigration, it had become common for the Orthodox in the USA to view themselves as the ethnic communities dispersed from the motherland. The same perspective historically colored the understanding of the nature of the Orthodox churches in North America. So the Greeks and the Greek Orthodox Church had that same mentality, etc., with all the other communities. Each jurisdiction came to see itself as a diaspora church and or as a geographic extension of the mother church. And honestly, if you read documents from the hierarchs from, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the patriarchs call us the diaspora. This is not something that's just being, reflected on now and created. This is something that's a very real designation. Consequently, Lexi goes on to say, instead of being a church serving the American people, the purpose of each Orthodox jurisdiction was to care for its people. And I think that's something you could definitely see in the pattern and the way the structures were built and how they operated, certainly through much of the 20th century. Their parishes have become the centers not only of a religious, but also a social life. Firstly, they have served to attract and to consolidate in certain geographic areas the newly arriving immigrants. Secondly, their functions transcend by far the religious needs and include, for instance, financial aid and many other services. At the beginning of a new millennium, of the 21st century, these immigrational services are still an essential part of the social work of many Orthodox churches in the USA. And why is that so? It's because those forced migrations did not stop with the mid-20th century, but in fact, there was more turmoil that brought Orthodox here. And before I get to mention some of those things, I do want to mention the benefit of this connection of ethnic identity with Orthodox faith. I mentioned at the very beginning, but it is definitely something that we need to reinforce here. All right. Now, Alexi goes on, side by side with social assistance intended to help the newcomers to begin a new life in the USA, many Orthodox jurisdictions gave priority to the preservation of the ethnic culture and identity among their members. Let us not forget that this intertwining of ethnic and religious identity had served the Orthodox churches well through the many centuries of Turkish domination, preserving faith and culture under terrible times, right? But now in this new land, this mindset led to certain unforeseen consequences. You definitely saw resistance in these communities to movements for Orthodox ecclesiastical and administrative unity. Now, I do want to underscore that there was never a time that we saw each other as having a different faith. We had doctrinal and sacramental unity throughout this time period and today as well. We have one faith, we share sacraments, we share liturgy. Yes, there are differences, but those are just superficial, if you will. The essence of the way in which we worship is the same. However, what we're talking about is the structural unity, sort of the umbrella that governs how we work as a church together. Another consequence is there was very little concern for mission, certainly through much of the 20th century. That's changing. I'm not saying that these are all, permanent. Things are changing. In part, they're changing because the church is becoming now, I hate to say it, self-consciously American, and a sense of wider unity. That's coming in the next few slides. Okay. Again, in the earlier expressions, and then sometimes also you see it in continuing in certain communities across the US, little concern for the wider society. Yes, plenty of philanthropy, but it's still within the ethnic group, okay? And indeed, everywhere, strong attachment to the ethnic language for worship and education. Okay. As the church settled into America, as the people stayed, married, were born here, children, grandchildren are born here, you do see the emergence of a more self-consciously American orthodoxy, one that is involved with the community of the American people, one that understands American history as belonging in some sense to these people now who are born and raised here. And you see different things occurring to express this. One of the most important figures in this emergence of American Orthodoxy was Archbishop Jacobus. For those of you who know that we had an Archbishop Jacobus in Chicago, this is not him. This is Archbishop Jacobus, who was Archbishop of the North and South America, actually, at the time. Enthroned in 1959, and the primate of the church here in America until, they were Greek church in America until 1996, when he stood down. He retired. Too complicated a story to tell there, but very beloved. All right. In 1960, you saw something extraordinary. The canonical Orthodox bishops across all the jurisdictions decided they were going to get together and work together, and something called SCOBA, the Standing Conference of Canonical Orthodox Bishops in America, was founded in 1960. In 1965, as early as 1965, SCOBA appeals to the mother churches to allow steps towards American Orthodox unity. And they began an official consultation with the Roman Catholics, which, by the way, is still ongoing. And Archbishop Jacobus marched with Dr. Martin Luther King very famously in the Selma to Montgomery marches. What does that say? It says, we are here, we are involved, we are part of the American landscape, and we have a voice to add to these voices. We have something to say. Still battling that move, there are waves of immigration. And as I said, I was going to mention this. After World War II, 100,000 Eastern European refugees come. Between 1966 and 1980, another big massive Greek immigration, including my husband, by the way. In 1991, you begin to see the refugees from the former Yugoslavia come. And then what do we see because of global events in the 21st century now? Populations from the Middle East are coming into, and of course that includes Orthodox coming to America. Show you some photos of Orthodox Christians, though, beginning to move into the public square of American life, beginning to dialogue with the other Christian communities, beginning to dialogue with each other. So in the lower right, the first photo of SCOBA. These are all the canonical bishops of the U.S. at that point meeting. You see Jacobus very famously walking with Martin Luther King, and yes, he made the cover of Life magazine. And yes, my husband actually got that magazine. I still have it. We own it because he bought the original when it happened. Here you see Orthodox entering the public square by participating in the March for Life, Orthodox Christians for Life. What other things do we see happening? Well, in 1970, the Russian Metropolia, remember I told you that was that group that sort of came out of the Russian mission, became the Russian diocese in America, started to operate independently. They reconciled with the Patriarch of Moscow, still under communism, so they didn't want to go under his oversight, but they reconciled with him and he granted them autocephaly. While some Orthodox autocephalous churches accepted and now accept the new autocephalous church as canonical, the majority did not and do not, including Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, and the Church of Greece. But I want to underscore here, although the question of the canonical status of the autocephaly of OCA remains undecided, the various Orthodox churches have continued to share sacramental unity. This is because doctrinal teaching and adherence to a common faith is not in dispute. Okay? It's just really a question of canonical sort of status, how you recognize it. The thinking is we are one church. We have one faith, one sacramental unity. But how you're going to describe that and sort of the rules and structures of the church is at dispute. Okay. So I say that we did not break sacramental unity because the same kind of issue has emerged in the most recent years with the Church of Ukraine being granted autocephaly by the ecumenical patriarch. Moscow has disputed it, and Moscow broke communion with Constantinople over that. That's very serious. That's very serious. But that didn't happen here. All right. The OCA is right now the first, and right now the only autocephalous Orthodox Church in the United States. All the others find their highest primate back in the old world country that they're connected to. Now, some of the churches are pretty independent here, but not when it comes to picking their primate. They still have to wait for that back in the old world country, except for the OCA. Some of the positive moves of American Orthodoxy seeking unity and moving into American life. So we see over the decades from 1965 to now, the establishment of pan-Orthodox groups that someday will operate as a unified body under a unified Orthodox Church in America. But they are working together now as a single group, Orthodox Christian Fellowship, OCF, for college students. And I didn't put everybody, I just put a bunch of them down. We'll see even more in a minute. They were founded in 1965, sort of fell apart, and then reestablished in 2001. The OCMC, Orthodox Christian Mission Center, founded in 1985 to promote worldwide Orthodox missionary activity. These are things founded here in America, okay, based here in America. Something extraordinary happened in 1987. A group of about 2,000 evangelical Christians who had discovered Orthodoxy came as a group, as a body, into Orthodoxy and were received into the Antiochian Archdiocese, initially becoming the Antiochian Evangelical Orthodox Mission. And they did a whole bunch of stuff with outreach. And honestly, we can thank this group for the Orthodox Study Bible and and lots of other stuff. They are fully integrated now, though, into Orthodox. The mission, the evangelical mission, as such, is sort of dissolved at this point. You see IOCC, International Orthodox Christian Charities, founded here in 1992. And then something else extraordinary happened at Antiochian Village in Pennsylvania. Most of the canonical Orthodox bishops in the US meet and they vote to terminate the language and the mindset of diaspora and work toward unity. You have some hierarchs very famously saying, we are no longer a diaspora. It did not sit well with the patriarchs back in the old world. Remember I told you Jacobus had to step down? It was because of this conference and his support of this. But some 15 years later, the patriarchs thought about things differently and felt that it was time for the Orthodox in America to begin a serious discussion about growing towards administrative unity and ultimately autocephaly. And in light of that, they approved the formation of, so now SCOBA turned into this, formation of the Episcopal Assembly of North and Central America. Now it's actually called the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops, USA. And they meet every year, 2-3 times a year, and work together on important things, including at some point, depending on the issues at hand, move towards jurisdictional unity instead of division. Some of the groups I want to point out, we have IOCC in the upper left and lower left, Orthodox Christian Charities, the support of missions overseas through OCMC, founded here and run here. What are some of the many pan-Orthodox agencies, initiatives, associations, and commissions that are out there? There's OTSA, the Orthodox Theological Society of America, with the theologians and academics and scholars and educators who are Orthodox, pan-Orthodox together. OCAMPER, the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion. Yes, doctors, psychologists, clergy, chaplains, nurses, therapists of all kinds. OCL, Orthodox Christian Laity, focuses on lay participation. The Orthodox Christian Prison Ministry, the Scouting Commission, the Education Commission. These are all pan-Orthodox. Orthodox Christian Network, for some of the media presentations. Zoe for Life, which is the pro-life national pan-Orthodox group. The Orthodox Peace Fellowship, and then Project Mexico and St. Innocent Orphanage, which brings Orthodox charities through mostly the work of young people going to Mexico and to the St. Innocent Orphanage to help out there. Some of the photos from that. We had at Saints Peter and Paul in 2019, we hosted the National OCAMPER meeting. Actually, we also hosted at the same time the National OTSA meeting. But you can see the OCAMPER meeting here gathered together, and our own Deacon Ted was one of the speakers, because, you know, Deacon Ted is a physician. So the Orthodox Christian Association of Medicine, Psychology, and Religion has Deacon Ted, and of course also Randa Anderson is one of those members. She was one of the organizers of this conference. Project Mexico, the Orthodox Prison Ministry, and the OTSA annual meeting. I'm a member of OTSA. Helped to organize that. So From jurisdictions to unity, autocephaly, one Orthodox Church in America. What are our challenges? I mentioned that because of the autocephaly of Ukraine, Moscow and Constantinople are currently not in communion. This is a schism. This is a very serious schism. Initially, there was even question as to whether we could continue to commune with each other here in the US, because the other Orthodox churches sort of lined up either behind Constantinople or behind Moscow. One of the biggest rifts was with the Serbians, who lined up behind Moscow. I teach at the Serbian Orthodox Seminary, and I'm a Greek. Our patriarchs are on different sides. There was a question about whether we could have communion in each other's churches, but the decision has now been in America to share communion. So I'm not saying every parish will do that, but that is the Episcopal decision here. How that will be sorted out. We have to pray, guys. Pray for reconciliation. Forgiveness and reconciliation. Anyway. All right. By the way, if you know anything about Orthodox history, you know this isn't the first time, but you don't want it to become permanent like it was with the Eastern and Western church communities. All right. Another challenge, what will be the relation? Let's say we do move towards autocephaly. How do we support and show respect to the mother churches? How will that operate? We need to allay any kind of fears on the part of mother churches that they will be somehow stranded, because many of them are in difficult places financially, politically, and really need the support of the communities in the United States. A big challenge. How do you preserve the unique and special ethnic expressions of the faith, not just for immigrants, but for future generations? There's much beauty in the way the different hymns are chanted, for example, or even in our iconographies, or in some of the other ways in which we express our faith. And all of this should be uplifted and retained. Why should it be in some way obliterated for the sake of unity? It certainly doesn't have to be. But how do you go about doing that? How do you go about doing that? Even probably more problematic is that many of these communities, we have two different calendars, the Julian calendar for some of the Orthodox communities, and the Gregorian, or the new calendar, the old calendar and the new calendar. Not touching that right now. Maybe in a question, but not at the moment. All right. But we also have vast differences in our resources, in the numbers of people. A lot of people, the Greeks are very numerous compared to the other Orthodox churches. They can be overwhelming. They can be a threat because of their large size. But is that going to continue to be a problem, or are there ways to move beyond it? All right. These are just some of the challenges that I wanted to lift up. What could be some of the benefits? Okay. And I didn't put these in any particular order. First of all, we get to pool our resources, because in a time when churches are struggling in numbers, in money, in having the programs that you need to educate your lay people, or your clergy. If we pool the resources, we can meet the needs more uniformly across the nation and service the smaller communities that are suffering greatly through the assistance of the larger communities, and one ethnic group with the other. we have a much more effective voice when we speak with one voice. Honestly, I cannot tell you how many people who are contemplating the possibility of becoming Orthodox are just so confused by the jurisdictional disunity that they just give up and walk away. They're like, well, which one do I go? Who do I talk to? Even something as simple as asking an Orthodox voice, in times of national crisis becomes a problem. Who officiates at the 9/11 service, and how do you present the faith when you are splintered and can't really agree with one another? It affects mission in particular, but it also affects effectiveness in promoting Orthodox values and teaching and presence in the American landscape. Of course, canonical status. I mean, if we could regulate that and restore it, it would be a wonderful thing. And one of the benefits is, can we actually come to a time where the Orthodox faith is expressed in the language and the culture of this land, where our children are being born, our grandchildren are being born, and subsequent generations? I tell people my grandchildren celebrate the 4th of July as their Independence Day, not the 25th of March, which is Greek Independence Day. You can celebrate that and remember it as something important for the peoples who came before you in your family. But you have a real identity as an American that needs to be celebrated. And all the other times the church has moved into the regions, there have been ways in which the faith found itself expressed, made incarnate, if you will, through the culture, the language, and the ways of the people. And we are an incarnational faith, right? It's not just something in our minds, it's something that we express with our whole physical self. And so this is something that can happen through Orthodox unity, jurisdictional unity in America. I am ending up with a couple of slides where I tried to find communities that I thought might be a picture of Orthodoxy that is Orthodox and American. And they come from different churches across the US. I did not record which church this is, but I put it in because you see people from sort of many different ages gathered together, different kinds of faces, if you will. But even more so, I think, with these two communities, and I did manage to identify which ones they are, but one's in California, and there's one in Maryland, which is OCA. But just the diversity of the American landscape being sort of mirrored in the diversity of a single united Orthodox community church in America. So I'm going to end there with a little time left for some questions, and just about 5 minutes. Comments, questions, or let me just add that since it's the last class of the whole session, I've been told if you have any burning questions from previous lessons that you kind of want to throw at me, hey, I'm game for it. I'll do my best to swing that pitch. So comments or thoughts or questions?
I just got a quick question. With the classes ending now, what's the process to go about getting baptized?
Process about going baptized, huh?
Yeah.
Well, you're talking to the one who's not the priest. So what you have to do is contact Father Rick, and he will give you a timeline and let you know if there are certain steps that you need to accomplish besides what you've already done.
Okay.
But yeah, so they, one thing I can tell you, you're going to need an Orthodox sponsor who is fully, legitimately Orthodox. Okay. No skeletons of the closet kind of Orthodox, because sometimes people think someone's Orthodox and then they find out that there was a problem, and so you need an Orthodox sponsor.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
that one's, I have to defer it to the priest.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.
Sure. And by the way, welcome. We will be more than happy to
Thank you.
embrace you and welcome you in. So
Thank you.
sure. Other questions or comments? I have to say, for people who are not Orthodox, sometimes they find all of this daunting. So I do want to underscore that through it all, even though at times we look like we're so different and we don't talk to each other, etc., there's a real sense, I think, among Orthodox that we are one church, we are one faith, we are one people before God. Like all families, we have our squabbles, and we've overcome so much through time. Days that were darker than could be you could never imagine. And Christ upholds his church through all of that. And so we have that assurance, that conviction that enables us to go forth with great hope. And I think what we really need in order to restore sacramental communion, etc., is humility. Humility, some forgiveness, and just listen to Christ. So anyway, all right. You will be getting in your emails, I'm sure there will be evaluation forms. Father Rick loves feedback, so don't hesitate to offer your feedback. And sort of on behalf, I guess, of all the people that join me in offering classes, I really thank you for taking the time. It's not easy to spend 2 hours on a Monday night, especially when we can't be together and sort of like really get to know one another. But I thank you for your commitment, and wish everybody well. And Kalo Pascha, have a great Pascha as we're coming up to it. Some glorious days ahead. So I don't know if Father, you might have gotten it in your emails, but our Metropolitan Nathaniel has held, he had a bit of a health crisis and was admitted to the hospital. He seems to be doing well. It's not COVID related, he said, but we don't know what's up. But he won't be joining us for Holy Week. His doctors won't allow him to join us for Holy Week. So keep our Metropolitan Nathaniel in your prayers. So he has a full recovery. He's really a wonderful man, and we're so blessed to have him. So we pray for his recovery. So, any more questions? All right, I'm going to release you all 1 minute early. All right, thank you guys. And
Hi, everybody.
you.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Really
you.
enjoyed being in class with all of you.
Yeah.